Good morning, good morning. Moving on to the next part of tools for analysis, we are going to focus on ratios. Ratios have a very important role in finance. The purpose of ratios is really to help us gain a better understanding of the firm and identifying its strengths and its weaknesses. We want to look at it so that we can incorporate this into the management decision, either internally or from an external perspective, from a lender or an investor. So it's used to identify, to help us look deeper. It's meaningful only within the context of the company's business cycle, which we've been talking about. Trends are more meaningful than an individual ratio. Looking them over time can tell us whether something is getting better or it's getting worse. We need to look at and acknowledge seasonal factors. If we have a company that is a very seasonal business, we may find different ratios at different times of the year. For example, right now it's springtime, so all your local nurseries and garden stores have a lot of inventory. When you get to the end of summer, that inventory number drops tremendously. That's because most of the sales happen in the spring and early summer. So we need to be aware of seasonal factors, but be able to distinguish between seasonal factors and real factors. And we need to ignore isolated things, that if it's something that's just oddball out there, we need to ignore that. Comparing them to the industry average is incredibly helpful, because that will bring in some of the business cycle within that industry group. So we can look at garden centers and see how our garden center compares to others. When we use them, we need to study any substantial or material deviation, either from the trend or relative to an industry. Always remember that a ratio has both a numerator and denominator. Okay? So a ratio could be, it's an outcome of two numbers. Things could be happening in the numerator component and not the denominator. We need to look at both of them. We need to look at compensating advantages. How are they tied together? We need to look at ratios within context and not look at them just as an individual ratio. And this is the first time that we need to look at ratios within context of the firm and the industry in which they do business. Now, I've had, my use of ratios has changed and evolved over time. And I think one of the things that's hit me based on a class that I took last summer was a cause and effect. Cause is why something happens. Effect is what happens as a result. So we have a number of causal ratios, those that affect profits, net worth, working capital, liquidity, and debt. The effect ratios are liquidity ratios, leverage, and profitability. So one causes another, which is coming back to our numerator and denominator. Now, one of the things that is important in any business is liquidity. You've got that liquidity, working capital, cash. You've gotten this through previous lectures. Yes, cash is the most important thing for a business to have. It's used to support the business cycle and for future expansion and growth. Without sufficient working capital, you cannot grow. In finance, we use the word liquidity. Liquidity includes current assets and current liabilities. But liquidity is multidimensional. And I think as we evolve and we take a deeper dive, I want you to think of liquidity from three perspectives. One, you need to have a quantity of liquidity, a quantity of adequate working capital. It has to be available when you need it, and it also has a quality component. So when we look at these multi-dimensions of liquidity, that's the quantity, the timing, and the quality, we can't look at them in isolation. We can't look at quantity separate from timing or quality. We need to look at all of the ratios around liquidity to be able to draw a conclusion around the firm's liquidity both now and in the future. So let's talk about some of the key ratios that go into liquidity and what they're telling us. Current ratio, current assets divided by current liabilities, right off the balance sheet. This tells us the quantity or amount of liquidity that a firm has. In a very subtle sense, it should be greater than 1 to maintain the current level of sales, but it needs to be greater to grow. If there's not enough and you want to grow, you have to put in more working capital, which we'll talk about when we get to capital next week. Now, the historical definition says if it's 1 or more, they could sell their current assets and pay off their current liabilities. That is a traditional definition. But I don't think it's meaningful today when we take a deeper dive into the concept of liquidity. One, it ignores the timing and quality of the working capital. Okay, it's great that you may have a current ratio that's greater than 1, but if it's not available when you need it or it's of appropriate quality, it isn't meaningful on a standalone basis. The last thing is the assumption is the firm is a going concern. So if it's a going concern, why would you sell your current assets to pay off your liabilities and essentially go out of business? That's an illogical conclusion. So I'd suggest that we're looking at it as that's a measure of the quantity of working capital. Cash conversion cycle, cash conversion cycle, which we talked about in the previous modules again. It's the cycle time of working capital expressed in days. We have the inventory conversion. How fast does inventory turn? Accounts collection. How fast do we collect them? Less accounts payable. How are we using other people's money? Gives us the cash conversion cycle in total. So we start looking at these individual components. Remember, this cash conversion cycle is telling us about speed or velocity. So we got to look at the quantity. Now we're looking at the timing. Having a lot of capital, but having a long conversion cycle is, you got to look at the two of them together. When we start looking at the quality of liquidity, let's start with receivables. We could look at total trade receivables divided by working capital, accounts receivable conversion period, and that we take right from the cash conversion cycle. We look at the receivable turnover. It's an activity ratio, very simple, sales divided by accounts receivable. How often do they turn over? We look at aging of receivables, percentage and by dollars, 30, 60, 90 days past due. These are internally prepared. We can't do this as an external observer. We can on the first 3. So when we look at this, these are the ratios that are key to understanding that, but it's within the context of liquidity. When we look at the collection period, it measures the credit and collection efficiency of the firm. Okay? The longer that cycle is, the collection period, it may be firm may not be efficient in collecting the receivables. There may be increases the probability of bad debt. But we need to look at them over time to see whether something's getting better or what it's being worse. And compare it to the industry. What is the industry doing? If the ratio is too high, okay, it can indicate inefficiency or decision to allow loose credit skills. So you need this balance. It's also looked at within an absolute return because it needs to be consistent with the firm's term. Some companies sell with 30 days. If it's 30 days, you should be under 30 days in your collection period. Okay? But that's based on the terms. So if we're looking at a restaurant, think about how you pay in a restaurant. You generally pay using cash and or a credit card. Credit cards are collected in a day or two. So if we were to look at a restaurant company, we would expect the collection period to be a day or two, if it's even listed on the financials, okay? Because it turns fast. So if we saw a McDonald's with accounts receivable of 20 days, something's wrong because they don't sell it. So we always got to come back and be consistent with the firm's terms. Okay, so now, again, some of this is so what? Well, what can we do to fix that? Well, we can either change the terms of sales, either shorten when the payment is due, shorten or lengthen. We might inject a cash discount to get people to pay faster, or we may eliminate it because people are taking advantage of it and it's getting paid very quickly. There could be more, we could have more systemic, improved collection follow-up, or on the other hand, relaxing of payment demands, adding a professional credit manager, obtaining credit insurance, develop options. Okay, so those are some of the things we can do when we see some of these ratios being. When you come back to liquidity, we're going to look at inventory. So we got cash, accounts receivable, inventory, and prepaid expenses for the most part. Cash is already in a liquid form. It takes a period of time to collect receivables. When we look at inventory, it takes time to process that. So the first thing we're looking at with inventory is total inventory divided by working capital. What percent of inventory comes, what percentage of working capital is by inventory? We don't want to see a huge percentage of working capital come from inventory because that may slow us down and may require more. Okay, so we look at the inventory conversion period, right from the cash conversion cycle to speed. We look at inventory turnover, cost of goods sold divided by inventory. We take a look at it relative to inventory to net sales to inventory, sales divided by inventory. Net sales to inventory, it's really telling us how efficient the merchandising is. A low ratio can be meaningful here because it means you're not turning as much inventory. So if inventory is sitting, we may have physical deterioration of inventory, obsolescence of inventory. You could have prices changing in the market. There could be seasonal variations. You could have overvaluation, unsaleable inventory. So this becomes important because the quality, the more you have in inventory relative to conversion cycle time, relative to working capital, we have these risks. So you want to look at it, but within the context of a business. If we're looking again at a restaurant business, we should see inventory turnover multiple times, a lot, because it's all fresh fruits and vegetables and meats. So we have that. So what can you do? So these are what the signals may be. What's the procedure? Well, you study the inventory records to detect if you have items that are no longer selling. Look at the components and go deeper. Establishment of a perpetual inventory record, meaning that's always updated based on the point of sale system. You purchase a merchandise on consignment that you don't pay for. You could do that. You could have loans on inventory to better fund the working capital. You may delegate the purchasing and inventory control function to others. You could look at this warehouse layout and storage areas and say, is it laid out the best way to be efficient? Promotion of increased sales. Could you hold the inventory the same while increasing sales? Is there any compensating advantage? So we look at all of these ratios are important causal ratios to the ability to obtain sales, profitability, and borrowing. So they become important causal ratios. When we look at this in conclusion in this liquidity piece, we say current ratio is quantity, cash conversion cycle is timing, inventory to working capital, inventory turnover, quality, receivables of working capital, quality. So these set out the basics around liquidity. What I'm going to show you in the next video is I am going to take the two tools and I'm going to apply that to GENESEO Coffee Company. If you have any questions, please let me know.